The morning sunlight streamed through the frosted bathroom window, casting a soft glow on the tiled walls. Steam from the hot shower swirled around me, curling like whispers in the air. It was my sanctuary, those precious minutes under the water, where the world outside faded away, leaving only the rhythmic sound of droplets hitting the porcelain floor. I had just finished rinsing the shampoo from my hair, wrapping myself in the thick white towel hanging on the rack. As I reached for my robe, a sudden chill ran down my spine, not from the cool air, but from the unsettling sensation that I wasn't alone. Turning slightly, I caught it out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, barely visible, lingering just beyond the bathroom door. The door, I realized with a jolt, wasn't fully closed. My heart skipped a beat as my mind raced. I hadn't heard anyone come in. Why would I? The house had always been my private haven, my retreat. But I wasn't entirely alone this weekend. Liam had arrived late last night, his overnight bag slung over his shoulder and his familiar grin in place. "I'll take care of the windows tomorrow," he'd said, referring to the repairs I'd been putting off for weeks. I'd forgotten all about it this morning as I stepped into the shower, the door left ajar in my haste to grab a towel. Now, standing there with only the soft fabric of the towel between me and whoever was outside, my breath caught in my throat. "Liam?" I called out, my voice shaky but sharp enough to cut through the steam-filled air. There was no immediate reply. The shadow moved slightly, and then I heard the faintest sound, footsteps retreating down the hall. For a moment, I stood frozen, my heart pounding as my mind tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had he seen me? The thought sent a flush of heat through me, mingling with the damp warmth of the room. I tightened the towel around myself and pushed the door open, stepping cautiously into the hallway. The house was quiet, save for the distant sound of the ocean waves outside. The door to the guest room was partially closed, and I could hear the faint hum of movement, Liam unpacking, perhaps, or tidying up. I took a deep breath, willing myself to calm down. It was nothing, I told myself. An accident. He probably hadn't even realized the door wasn't fully shut. Still, as I walked to my bedroom to get dressed, I couldn't shake the image of the shadow lingering by the door, or the strange flutter in my chest at the thought that Liam might have seen more than I intended. By the time I made my way to the kitchen, dressed and composed, Liam was already there. He stood by the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "Morning," he said, his tone casual, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes when he glanced at me. "Morning," I replied, my voice steady despite the lingering tension in my chest. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing mine briefly. "Hope I didn't wake you earlier," he said. "I was trying to get an early start on the windows." "No, you didn't," I said quickly, though my mind was already racing again. Did he know? Was this his way of glossing over what had happened? We sat at the small kitchen table, the morning sunlight spilling across the worn wooden surface. Liam sipped his coffee, his gaze flicking toward me now and then, as though he wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the words. I focused on my coffee, trying to keep my thoughts in check. But the silence between us felt heavier than usual, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us seemed willing to address. Finally, Liam cleared his throat. "So what's the plan for today?" he asked, his tone deliberately light. I looked up at him, forcing a smile. "I thought I'd leave the windows to you," I said. "Unless you need me to help." "I think I can manage," he replied, his grin returning. But there was still that flicker in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made my chest tighten. As the day went on, I tried to push the morning's events from my mind, throwing myself into housework while Liam worked on the windows. But every time our paths crossed, him passing me a tool, me handing him a towel to wipe the dust from his hands, the memory of that fleeting moment by the bathroom door came rushing back. By evening, I was exhausted, though not from the chores. It was the weight of the unspoken tension between us, the way his eyes seemed to linger just a second too long, the way my pulse quickened whenever he was near. As I lay in bed that night, the sound of the waves lulling me toward sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, and for the first time in years, I wasn't sure if I wanted to ignore it. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a hammer tapping lightly against the frame of the kitchen window. Liam was already at work. The faint scent of coffee drifted down the hall, and I could hear his easy hum mingling with the rhythm of his movements. After a quick shower, this time making sure the door was firmly shut, I dressed and made my way to the kitchen. Liam stood by the open window, securing a new latch. The early sunlight streaming through the glass bathed him in a warm glow, and for a moment, I hesitated in the doorway, watching him. He looked so at ease, so focused. "Morning," I said finally, stepping into the room. He turned to me, his smile soft but genuine. "Morning. Coffee still hot?" I poured myself a cup and leaned against the counter, watching as he finished the last few adjustments to the latch. "Done," he announced with a satisfied grin, brushing his hands off on his jeans. "Looks good," I said, taking a sip of coffee. He leaned against the window frame, his gaze settling on me. "You've got a nice place, Meredith, even if it's a bit drafty." I laughed, shaking my head. "Well, that's why you're here, isn't it? To fix all the things I've been ignoring?" "Among other things," he replied, his tone light but carrying an edge of something deeper. I felt my cheeks warm under his gaze and quickly turned my attention back to my coffee. We spent most of the morning working on small projects around the house, replacing light bulbs, fixing loose cabinet hinges, and even rearranging a few pieces of furniture to make the space feel less empty. Liam was as attentive and patient as ever, offering his usual humor to lighten the mood. But there was something different about the way he moved, the way he spoke. His presence felt heavier, somehow, more deliberate. At one point, as we shifted the sofa to a new spot in the living room, I lost my grip, the edge of the fabric slipping from my hands. "Careful," Liam said, stepping forward quickly to steady it. His hand brushed mine, and for a moment, we both froze. Our eyes met, and the space between us seemed to shrink. I could feel the warmth of his hand against mine, the faint rise and fall of his breath. "Got it?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said quickly, pulling back. "Thanks." By lunchtime, the tension between us had grown into an unspoken undercurrent that neither of us seemed willing to address. We sat at the kitchen table, sharing a quiet meal of sandwiches and chips, the occasional clink of our glasses against the wood breaking the silence. "So," Liam began, his tone casual, "what's next on the list?" I glanced at the notepad I'd left on the counter, running through the tasks in my mind. "There's the back door. It's been sticking lately, and the closet in the guest room could use a new hinge." "Easy enough," he said with a nod. "Anything else?" I hesitated, my gaze lingering on him longer than I intended. "No, I think that's it for now." "Okay," he said, his smile returning. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of hammering, drilling, and quiet exchanges. By the time we finished for the day, the house felt lighter, as though the physical repairs had somehow lifted the emotional weight that had been hanging over it. "You've done a lot," I said as we stood in the living room, surveying the results of our work. "Well, it's easy when the company's good," Liam replied, his tone light but sincere. I smiled, my chest tightening at the warmth in his voice. "Thank you, Liam. Really." He shrugged, his grin turning playful. "Just doing my part." That evening, after Liam had gone to shower, and I was left alone in the kitchen, I found myself replaying the day's moments in my mind. The way his hand had lingered on mine, the quiet intensity in his gaze, the way his presence seemed to fill the house in a way I hadn't realized I needed. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking things. But deep down, I knew better. Later, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, the air between us felt heavy again. Not with discomfort but with something unspoken, something neither of us seemed ready to name. "This was a good day," Liam said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "It was," I agreed, though my chest tightened at the weight of the moment. He turned to look at me, his eyes catching the fading light. "I'm glad I came," he said. "Me too," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment we just sat there, the sound of the waves filling the space between us. And though neither of us said it aloud, I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Something was changing, and neither of us could stop it. The following day, the air in the house felt different, charged, like the moments just before a storm. Liam had finished most of the repairs and suggested tackling the last project, painting the small sunroom that overlooked the backyard. It'll brighten the space, he said, standing in the doorway with a can of paint in one hand and a roller in the other. I hesitated, unsure if spending another entire day in close proximity to him was a good idea. But the look in his eyes, hopeful, expectant, was hard to refuse. Okay, I said finally, grabbing a brush. The sunroom had always been my favorite part of the house, but years of neglect had dulled its charm. The pale blue walls were chipped and faded, and the wooden floor creaked underfoot. We worked in near silence at first, the sound of brushes and rollers filling the space. But as the hours passed, the quiet began to give way to easy conversation. Liam told me stories about his childhood, about how Paul used to take him fishing on weekends. I shared memories of my own, how Paul had taught me to garden, how we'd spent endless summers in this very sunroom, talking about nothing and everything. The memories brought a bittersweet ache to my chest. But Liam's laughter and warmth made it bearable. At one point, as I stretched to reach a high corner, the ladder wobbled slightly beneath me. Careful, Liam said, stepping forward instinctively. I've got it, I assured him, though my grip on the roller tightened. But the ladder shifted again, and before I could react, Liam was there, his hands steadying me by the waist. Gotcha, he said, his voice close, his breath warm against my shoulder. I froze, my heart racing as his hands lingered for just a moment longer than necessary. Thanks, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. No problem, he replied, stepping back, though his gaze held mine for a moment before he turned away. By late afternoon, we had finished the first coat of paint. The room felt brighter already, the pale yellow walls catching the sunlight and filling the space with warmth. It looks great, I said, standing back to admire our work. It does, Liam agreed, his gaze shifting from the walls to me. But I think you've got a little paint. He gestured to his cheek, and I raised a hand to touch mine. Here? No, the other side, he said, stepping closer. Before I could move, he reached out, his thumb brushing gently against my skin. The gesture was so soft, so intimate, that it stole the breath from my lungs. There, he said, his voice low. Thanks, I murmured, my chest tightening as I met his gaze. For a moment, neither of us moved, the air between us thick with tension. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the faint scent of paint and soap clinging to his skin. And then, as if realizing he had lingered too long, Liam stepped back, clearing his throat. I'll clean up the brushes, he said, his tone clipped. Okay, I replied, though my voice trembled. That evening, as we sat together on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon in a blaze of orange and pink, the tension between us felt impossible to ignore. Today was productive, Liam said, breaking the silence. It was, I agreed, though my mind was far from the sunroom. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. You've been quiet, he said softly. Just tired, I replied, though we both knew it wasn't true. He nodded, his gaze drifting out toward the water. Can I ask you something? Of course, I said, though my stomach tightened at the seriousness in his tone. Do you ever feel like... He trailed off, as if searching for the right words. Like there's something missing? I hesitated, his question catching me off guard. All the time, I admitted finally. Me too, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The quiet stretched between us, filled with the soft sound of waves and the distant hum of cicadas. I don't know what I'm doing half the time, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Since Paul, I've just been trying to hold it together. But sometimes, it feels like I'm barely managing. Liam turned to me, his eyes filled with an intensity that made my breath catch. You don't have to do it alone, you know, he said. I know, I said, though my voice wavered. He reached out, his hand covering mine. I mean it, he said softly. I'm here. The weight of his words, the warmth of his touch was almost too much to bear. I pulled my hand back, my chest tightening. I should go inside, I said quickly, standing. Meredith, he began, his voice low, almost pleading. But I shook my head, unable to meet his gaze. Good night, Liam. Good night, he said, though the word carried an edge of disappointment. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way his hand had felt against mine, the quiet certainty in his voice when he said he was there for me. The attraction between us was undeniable, but it was also terrifying. I couldn't ignore the way he made me feel, alive, seen, but I also couldn't shake the fear of what it all meant. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain. And I didn't know if I was brave enough to take the leap. The storm outside had started as a light drizzle in the late afternoon, but had grown into a steady downpour by nightfall. Rain pelted against the windows, a rhythmic drumbeat that filled the house with a strangely calming presence. Liam was in the living room, finishing the last adjustments to the closet door he had repaired earlier, while I busied myself in the kitchen. I tried to focus on the chopping board in front of me, slicing vegetables for a soup I didn't particularly want to make. But my thoughts kept drifting to him, to the way his hand had lingered on mine earlier that day, the quiet intensity in his eyes when he'd said he was there for me. I could hear him moving around in the other room, the sound of his tools clinking against the floor. Every noise made my pulse quicken, an unspoken tension building between us that neither of us seemed willing to address. The sound of the rain grew louder, and a clap of thunder rumbled in the distance. I glanced toward the living room and, before I could stop myself, walked down the hall to check on him. Liam was kneeling by the closet door, tightening the last screw. His shirt clung slightly to his back, damp from the humidity in the air, and his movements were fluid, focused. He didn't notice me at first, and I hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to say. "Need any help?" I asked finally, my voice soft. He turned, startled for a moment before his lips curved into a small smile. "I think I've got it," he said, his tone light. I stepped closer, the rain outside muffling the sound of my footsteps. "You've been busy today," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, setting the screwdriver aside. "Keeps me out of trouble," he said, though his gaze lingered on me in a way that made my chest tighten. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the space between us filled with the sound of the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. "Meredith," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I looked at him, my breath catching at the seriousness in his tone. "Yes?" He hesitated, his hands resting on his knees as he searched for the right words. "I can't keep pretending that nothing's changed," he said finally. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a rush of warmth flood my cheeks. "Liam, I don't think—" "I'm not asking you to think," he interrupted gently, standing and stepping closer. "I'm asking you to feel. To be honest with yourself, with me." The intensity in his gaze was almost too much to bear, and I took a step back, my hands trembling. "This isn't. It's not simple," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's not," he said, his voice soft but firm, "but that doesn't mean it's wrong." I shook my head, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "Liam, we can't." "Why not?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Who says we can't? Who makes these rules?" His frustration was palpable, and I felt my chest tighten as I struggled to find the words to explain. "I'm scared," I admitted finally, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Liam's expression softened instantly, and he stepped closer, his hands reaching out to rest gently on my arms. "I know," he said, his voice low, "but you don't have to be." The warmth of his touch, the steady reassurance in his voice, was almost enough to break through the wall I'd built around myself. Almost. "I don't know if I can do this," I whispered, my tears spilling over. "You don't have to know right now," he said, his thumb brushing softly against my arm. "Just stay here with me. Let's figure it out together." I looked up at him, my vision blurred by tears, and saw nothing but sincerity in his eyes. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't keep running from what I felt. Without thinking, I closed the space between us, my hands reaching for his as I leaned into him. "Liam," I whispered, my voice trembling. He cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but sure. "I'm here," he said softly. His lips met mine, the kiss slow and tentative at first, as though we were both afraid of breaking whatever fragile understanding had formed between us. But as the seconds passed, it deepened, the unspoken tension between us finally giving way to something raw and undeniable. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, the sound of the rain and thunder replaced by the steady rhythm of our breathing, the warmth of his touch grounding me in the moment. Liam's hand slid down my arms, pulling me closer, and I let myself lean into him, my own hands gripping the fabric of his shirt as though he were the only thing keeping me steady. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't neat or planned or anything close to what I thought I wanted. But it was real, and it was ours. When we finally pulled apart, We were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as the weight of what had just happened settled over us. "This changes everything," I whispered, my voice shaking. "It doesn't have to," Liam said softly, his hand still resting on my waist. "We'll take it one step at a time." I nodded, though the fear still lingered at the edges of my mind. "Okay," I said finally. The rest of the evening passed in a quiet blur. Liam stayed close, his presence a constant reassurance as we sat together in the living room, the storm outside finally beginning to wane. When it was time to head to bed, he kissed me softly at the door, his touch lingering as though he didn't want to let go. "Good night, Meredith," he said, his voice warm and steady. "Good night," I replied, my chest tight as I watched him walk away. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the events of the evening in my mind. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. But for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and fresh. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden streaks across the floor. The house was quiet, save for the faint creak of the floorboards as I padded into the kitchen. I was surprised to find Liam already there. He was standing at the counter, a cup of coffee in his hand, gazing out the window. The light hit him just right, illuminating the strong lines of his profile. And for a moment, I let myself just look at him. When he turned and saw me, a smile softened his expression. "Morning," he said, his voice low and warm. "Morning," I replied, my chest tightening at the memory of the night before. We sat at the small kitchen table, the space between us both charged and fragile. Liam seemed calm, but his eyes held a quiet intensity that made my pulse quicken. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. I hesitated, not knowing how to answer. I didn't sleep much," I admitted finally. "Me neither," he said, his lips curving into a small, understanding smile. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with everything we weren't saying. I wanted to ask him what came next, to understand how he could seem so steady when I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. But before I could find the words, Liam leaned forward, his gaze steady. "We should talk," he said softly. I nodded, though my stomach twisted with anxiety. "You're right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know last night was a lot," he began, his tone careful. "And I don't want you to feel pressured or overwhelmed. But I need you to know that I meant every word I said." I looked down at my coffee cup, my hands trembling slightly as I traced the rim with my finger. "I don't even know where to start," I admitted. "Start with how you feel," he said, his voice steady but kind. I took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I feel scared," I said, "and confused, and alive. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm actually living instead of just going through the motions. But that scares me too." Liam reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said softly. "We can take it slow, one step at a time." I looked up at him, my chest tightening at the sincerity in his eyes. "But what if people find out?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What will they think?" "They'll think whatever they want to think," he said, his voice firm. "But this isn't about them, Meredith. This is about us. What do you want?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and unyielding, and for the first time I allowed myself to answer it honestly. "I want to be happy," I said, my voice breaking. "I want to stop feeling like I'm stuck in the past. I want you." Relief washed over Liam's face and he squeezed my hand gently. "Then that's all that matters," he said. The simplicity of his words, the quiet certainty in his voice, was enough to steady me. We spent the rest of the morning together, moving around the house as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. Liam worked on organizing the tools in the garage while I tidied up the living room, but our paths crossed often, brushing hands, lingering glances, unspoken promises. That afternoon, as the sun hung high in the sky, Liam suggested a walk along the beach. "It'll clear our heads," he said, his smile easy but his eyes serious. I agreed, slipping on my sandals and following him out the back door. The sand was warm beneath my feet, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, grounding. We walked in silence for a while, the space between us shrinking with every step. When we reached a small cove hidden by rocky cliffs, Liam stopped, turning to face me. "Meredith," he began, his voice low, "I need to know." Are you with me in this? I looked at him, my heart pounding. I don't know what this is, I admitted, but I don't want it to end. That's enough for me, he said, stepping closer. His hands found mine, and he pulled me toward him, his gaze locked on mine. You're enough for me, he said softly, his voice filled with conviction. The words undid me, and before I could think I was in his arms, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. The world around us seemed to fade, the sound of the waves and the warmth of the sun a distant hum. Liam's hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself melt into him, the weight of my fears momentarily lifting. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, wrapped in each other, the world beyond the cove forgotten. When we finally pulled apart, Liam rested his forehead against mine, his breathing uneven. I love you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew the truth of my own feelings. I love you too, I said, my voice trembling but sure. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet moments and unspoken understanding. That night, as we sat together on the porch, the stars scattered across the sky like tiny diamonds, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. We talked about the future, not in specifics, but in broad strokes, painting a picture of a life that was messy and complicated but ours. You're sure about this? I asked, my voice quiet. I've never been more sure of anything, Liam said, his hand brushing against mine. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe him. The next morning, the sunlight streamed through the windows, warm and golden, illuminating the quiet stillness of the house. For the first time in years, I woke up with a sense of calm that felt unfamiliar yet welcome. The heaviness that had lingered for so long seemed to have lifted, leaving behind something lighter, something hopeful. I found Liam in the kitchen, his back to me as he poured 2 cups of coffee. He turned when he heard my footsteps, his easy smile softening as our eyes met. Morning, he said, his voice warm and steady. Morning, I replied, taking the cup he offered. We stood there for a moment, sipping our coffee in comfortable silence. The memory of the day before lingered between us, unspoken but undeniable. As we moved through the morning, tidying the house and preparing for the week ahead, the tension that had defined so many of our previous interactions was gone. Instead, there was an ease between us, a quiet understanding that neither of us needed to voice. By mid-morning, Liam suggested another walk on the beach. One last stroll before I head out, he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. I hesitated, the thought of him leaving twisting something inside me. But I nodded, slipping on my sandals and following him out the door. The beach was nearly empty, the waves lapping gently at the shore as we walked side by side. The sun was warm on my skin, the breeze carrying the faint scent of salt and seaweed. For a while we didn't speak, the sound of the ocean filling the space between us. But as we reached the rocky cove where we had shared so many quiet moments, Liam stopped, turning to face me. I've been thinking, he began, his voice careful. About what? I asked, though my chest tightened at the seriousness in his tone. About us, he said simply. He took a step closer, his hand reaching for mine. I know this isn't easy, he said, and I know there are a lot of things we'll have to figure out. But I meant what I said yesterday. I want this. I want us. I looked at him, my heart pounding. Liam, what if? What if it works? He interrupted gently, his gaze steady. His words hung in the air, so simple yet so profound. And as I looked at him, standing there with the ocean stretching endlessly behind him, I felt a clarity I hadn't expected. I don't know what the future looks like, I admitted, my voice trembling. But I don't want to go back to the way things were. I want to move forward. With you. Relief washed over his face, and he squeezed my hand gently. We'll figure it out, he said. As we made our way back to the house, the reality of what lay ahead began to settle in. Liam would leave later that afternoon, returning to his life in the city. And I would stay here, in the house that had once been filled with so many memories of Paul but now held new ones that were ours. But as we stood on the porch, the car keys dangling from his hand, I felt a strange sense of peace. I'll call you when I get back, he said, his voice soft. I nodded, my chest tightening. Drive safe. He hesitated, then leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was tender and full of promise. I'll see you soon, he said, his forehead resting against mine for a moment before he stepped back. As I watched him drive away, a mix of emotions swirled inside me: sadness, hope, fear, and something deeper. I didn't know what the future held for us. There would be challenges, questions, and decisions we'd have to face. But for the first time in years, I felt ready to face them. Later that evening, as I stood by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon, I slipped the necklace Liam had given me around my neck, the cool metal resting against my skin, like a quiet reminder of everything we had shared. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was ours. And that was enough.